All right, let's get started on our presentation today, and we're going to kick off with the bat with a poll question here. So we wanted to see, do you have any experience with data analytics in the hiring process? And so we have a couple options here. The first one, A, what do you mean by data analytics? B, I know enough just to be dangerous, but that's why I'm here today. C, I'm a data analytics master in training. Or D, I'm a data analytics Jedi. All right, Holly, let's pop over and see if we can see how those results are coming in.
Looks like these are populating live, so as people continue to respond, we'll get a better sense of the audience, but at least leaning towards the less experienced side, which is always a nice thing. That means we can hopefully have some discussion and give you some useful pieces of information to take away as we go through this session today. But we do have at least a range of responses from what do you mean by data analytics all the way through to master in training, which is great. We've got a nice representation of experience through this session, and hopefully that'll also make for some good questions at the end of the session. So definitely, if we don't answer questions that you have in your mind, send those in so that we can spend some time on those at the end of the session.
All right, that's great, Holly. Let's see if we can continue on now. All right, so let's boil this down. What is data analytics? There's two parts to it. Data, which is typically the structured recording of events, and then the second portion is analytics, so the discovery, interpretation, and then communicating the meaningful patterns from that data. So they go hand in hand with that respect. All right, so more in depth here, the description of data. It's a structured recording of events. It's never without its bias. There's always some level of error prone to everything. It always occurs within a specific context. So how important is rainfall how important is rainfall in your given area? Well, it depends upon groundwater nearby. Are you a farmer, so you need more water? Are you a builder, so you need less water? So everything has a context around it. We go to another, yeah. So it's never without bias. There's some error there, and some error is totally random. You can't predict it, and then some data has inherent biases within it. So you might have the case where your error is just completely random. There's a leaf that falls on your rain gauge, and so you won't get as much rain as you should. Then you have other types of error which are bias, which if you build your rain gauge underneath a tree, it's not going to collect all the rain that it's supposed to get. So there's two types of biases there.
And there's lots of situations. Anytime you're collecting data, these types of issues will come up. You're always going to have some level of error and some level of bias. And I think it's important to kind of to think about that, to plan for it as you're doing your data collection, and also kind of factor it into your analytics. There are ways that we can talk about to address that, to look at outliers and to try to trim those things. There's other contexts. Anytime you're collecting data, you're going to run into these issues. So if you were looking at something as simple as the average annual salary in an area, well, if you do your data collection in Beverly Hills, California, that's going to create bias. All of the people that are walking up and down the street are going to have a much higher than average annual salary, and that's going to skew your data in a way that's not representative if you're trying to sample the entire country. And you can think of another example. If I go to Omaha, Nebraska, which seems like a pretty representative, right in the middle of America, and I collect my data there, but I happen to ask Warren Buffett, who walks by on the street, what his annual salary is, that's going to create error in my sample. That one data point is going to skew the results in such a way that they're not going to be representative just because of that one single case. So hopefully those are some useful ways to conceptualize these concepts of error and bias. They're always important as you're going into data collection. And like we said, by planning for them to make sure that can address some of the issues up front and make sure that once you get the data in hand, that you'll be able to make good use of it and be less likely to have these adversely impact your analytics.
Great point, Keith. And once again, these must be interpretable in order to have any kind of use. So going back to the rain, does this compare to earlier storms this year? Does this compare to previous years? It all has to be within the context of other forms of data. So there's several common sources of data in the whole human capital industry here. You commonly can get turnover and sales numbers for certain individuals. You can get engagement surveys and performance reviews. Certain clients we've seen collect customer satisfaction and even NPS scores. And then some of the most impactful ones that we've seen are productivity measures and then personality assessment results.
And I think a good point here is around data analytics. You can collect each one of these pieces of data in isolation and analyze them on their own. So it's useful to take a look at sales numbers. How did region A do in sales versus region B? And that's one level of analytics. And then where we get a lot of questions from our clients is around how to integrate these various points of data. So how do I take a look at my personality assessment results in relation to the effect that they have on sales numbers? Or how do I look at engagement surveys and the impact that they have on turnover? So by starting to take these different classes of data and to cross-analyze those and merge the information together, you can get a lot of power out of that, which can then drive the impact on the business. You can make decisions on how do we use these as levers and modify things about each one of those factors that will have an impact on the business, impact our sales numbers, impact our turnover, et cetera, et cetera.
Great point there. So once we have our data, what do we do with it? Well, we need to analyze it. All the data in the world is great, but ultimately useless unless it is analyzed. So analytics within itself doesn't fix our problem. Whatever analysis comes out of it must be actionable. We must be able to do something with it. It provides information which can help lead to clearer understandings of the problem. So just giving a whole bunch of statistics there is not helpful, but it needs to be driven by some expertise and some actionable results at the end of it. It is only useful as far as the ability to change something within the company as it approaches a problem.
I think the cartoon on the right highlights a great topic, which is sometimes having more data is not better. If you have too much data, sometimes that's just as bad as not having enough. So it's really about having the right information or having the right information presented in the right way. You have to categorize it. You have to clean it. You have to have confidence in the quality of that information so that you can analyze that and then make some informed decisions based on that.
That's a great segue to our next slide here, Keith. You got to know what you're looking for. So if you have collected all the data in the world, it's going to be too much for you to analyze and get any actual results there. So the more data you have, the easier it is to convince you that the right result, but you need to be collecting the right information. Expertise can always help. Anyone who has experience with a similar problem online or in other industries can always help, but it may be helpful in identifying interesting results that you may want to explore further. And then the diagram here out to the side that as you get more and more pieces of data and more larger and larger samples, you can begin to find more actionable results and be more confident in your results just because you have more and more data points.
But having said that, you also need to be careful in the hypothesis that you create. So that the more variables that you have, sometimes there's I guess kind of a pull to want to look at each one of those relationships individually, and the more hypotheses that you create, the more analysis you run. Sometimes you can get into that
never-ending,
the never-ending circle of looking at things over and over again, and by random chance, you're going to find some effect somewhere in your analysis. You know, if you look at enough correlations or you compare enough different variables together, something interesting is going to jump out. And I think Casey's got a great point there on the slide around replication. It's critically important if you find an effect one time to try to look for that again and to make sure that it is something that's a true difference between these two groups that you're looking at, or a true effect that you're finding there by replicating it.
And it's not just that error that we talked about earlier.
Right. It's not just that random chance. The one person walking by on the street that you collected data from, whose average salary was so far and above the norm that they're unduly influencing the data that you have in hand. And that's one of those key points around replication. If you have lots and lots of data, so if you have thousands of records of information or hundreds of thousands of records, it's tempting to look at all of that data in aggregate so that you have this great big sample size. But there's a great opportunity there to do more of a classic research design where you split that data in half and you say, what are the trends if I look at this sample of 50,000 people and do those trends hold up if I look at a second sample of 50,000 people, or even if it's 200 versus 200, rather than looking at all your data together, split it up. It gives you a chance to verify and to confirm that effect that you're seeing so that you have more confidence in the analysis and more confidence in the decisions that you're taking based on that analysis.
Great point there, Keith. And then so how to set your business up to leverage these analytics. As we pointed out earlier, you have to structure your data collection to help answer important questions. If you're interested in the performance of your employees, using performance of the stores may not always be the most helpful because they're so far removed from each individual employee. What effect can that one employee have on the result of your entire store when there might be 500 employees there? So you need to know what you want to have your outcome be, what problem you're trying to solve here, and get great data around that problem. So if you're trying to improve performance of each individual employee, you need numbers. What does that employee do during the day? What time they show up? What's the turnover for each individual employee in order to have some kind of impact there? So to help with that, you need to develop some hypotheses that really come into play there. You need to look before you leap there. Always a good starting point is how confident are you in that? So if you're willing to say, I bet $100 that I can predict this change, you want to be pretty confident in your hypothesis there.
Yeah, and that'll help you focus in on the right tool, whether you need the telescope approach or the microscope or the magnifying glass to take a look at that data. That helps with that level of analysis issue.
Yep.
Good. Okay. So hopefully that's got your gears turning on this topic a little bit. We wanted to stop and have our second poll here. If you think about your current business, what is your biggest challenge in data analysis today? So Holly will be launching that poll. You should see that up on your screen and have an opportunity to respond. And your options here are the challenge is not having access to the right data versus having access to too much data, kind of that needle in the haystack issue. Not being able to marry the data, different databases or different formats of data that don't cooperate and play nice with one another, not knowing how to analyze it, or having unclear criteria, not even really being sure of what to focus on. And it looks like we have a clear winner, and we can certainly empathize with you. I know that Casey and I face that challenge often with our data. Being in the business as external consultants where we're partnering with our clients to marry our data with their internal data sources to try to find some useful analytics and to look at these patterns between assessment data and performance metrics or turnover. That's a common challenge that we face is that difficulty in marrying the data. How do you align the data and match it up and make sure that it's accurately tagged, all of those sorts of challenges. Although it looks like we certainly face the other issues, but the primary one seems to be jumping out there in the middle. And so we certainly empathize with you on that and can talk about some of the ways to deal with that. But that's interesting to see that's such a constant theme.
We feel your pain.
Yeah, we feel your pain. Thank you for your input on that. Jump back to the presentation now. There we go. Good. So now we're going to jump into using data analytics to solve problems. So these are some real-world scenarios that we wanted to talk through. And so these are cases where we were able to make that leap and take some data that we had through our assessment technology and merge it together with client data to make some useful insights on their business that supported the use of the types of hiring analytics and assessments we do at OutMatch. So we'll jump into that.
So looking at this first one that everybody's concerned about, turnover. Turnover is much like all mortality. No one wants to die. Everyone wants to live forever. But there's two things for sure in life, death and taxes and
employee turnover.
And employee turnover now. So, but we do want to lower it as much as possible. So we need to start looking at understanding why do people turn over and what can be prevented and what can't be prevented. So there's some great analytics in this case that can help better get at why people turn over. You can start asking questions, does it happen in a specific set of months, a certain time of year? Are there times during the employee life cycle that the company, that are people more risky within your company? Or is there an assessment helping resolve turnover issues? Can you hire better people by using assessments to look at that turnover difference.
And we make that comparison to mortality because just like with mortality, there's some things about it happening that you can control and other things that are totally outside of your control. So your genes play a role in how long you live, as well as how you eat over the course of your life and how much you exercise, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But with employee turnover, you see the same types of things emerge. The companies could go out of their way to try to minimize turnover as much as possible, and some portion of that is still going to happen. That's totally outside of their control. So the analogy works very well, and it's a similar set of issues that you face.
All right, so real-world example here, taking from one of our clients in the financial industry. We've been able to help look at their data and analyze it and give them ways to improve turnover. So we took our assessment results, we generally bucketed that into a not recommended employees and recommended employees, and just within the first 30 days, we're able to see an 8% improvement on turnover just within 30 days. And then if we expand that further to an additional 30 days, that 30 to 60 day range, we're able to see a 14% reduction in turnover. And while this sounds kind of minuscule, if you look at that over the course of a year and an employee were to hire 94 bad hires or not recommends, that ends up costing the company about $3,500 for each of those, which can account for over $300,000 in lost revenue for the company by hiring poor employees. So if you analyze things up front and you know whether people are probabilistically going to be poor employees or likely to turn over, you can reduce and end up saving quite a bit of money there.
And that $3,500 estimate of a bad hire factors in some of those basic things. It's the cost to retrain somebody else, the cost to go out and recruit somebody in the first place,
job posting,
to train them, to implement them on the job. There's ramp-up time. It takes people a while to get up to speed in the role, as well as all of those kind of ancillary effects of if they had a negative interaction with a customer, what does that cost the company over time for that bad hire to be in the role for a period of time and to cause bad experiences and kind of negative publicity for the organization from that standpoint. All of that adds up $3,500 to be a pretty conservative estimate. And once, like Casey said, once you start to multiply that out, it can really have a significant impact on the bottom line. One of the other interesting things that we saw here is when if you take that level of analysis issues, sometimes it's important to break out the data into smaller buckets so that you can get a sense of where the effects are really happening. So if we would have just looked at this data over the first 60 days in the role and not broken it out, the message gets a little more muddled. We still would have seen an impact for turnover, but really our hypothesis, you're not able to actually look at the reasons for this, but one hypothesis is that early turnover, that 0 to 30-day turnover, a lot of the people that bounce in that time window and choose to leave the job are doing so because it's not a right fit. There's some sort of a culture fit, so we have them take a work-related personality assessment, maybe some basic cognitive ability assessments or culture fit questions. And what you're seeing is that those people just don't fit and they quickly leave the organization. But there's even more of an amplified effect over that 31 to 60-day window, where once people get up to speed in the role and start to perform, you have an even higher rate of turnover for those bad hires where, because they're a poor fit, they don't have what it takes to be successful in the role, they're leaving at a higher rate even over the long haul. So there's kind of an interesting difference, and it's likely slightly different facets of turnover that we're impacting there. But it certainly does have a strong impact. Great point, Keith.
And then just to drive this point home, we took another example from our clientele here and looked at an individual in the energy industry and then saw their impact on turnover. And here we were able to extrapolate even further beyond that 30 and 60-day range and see that for that 30-day range, we had that 17% reduction in turnover, amplified again during that 30 to 60-day turnover range. And then that was about a 25% change. And then you can see that it slightly diminishes the further and further it goes out. And then this drives home Keith's point that there's a lot that can change. It can be not the right job fit for people. And you see that really early on in the process. And then there's so many other factors that can come into play the longer and longer that goes on. People get married. They want to move to different regions. They go
relationship with a manager. Any of those things can start to impact it.
That there's so many outside sources of turnover that it's hard to distinguish that the further and further you get away from the hiring process.
But to Casey, another point that Casey made earlier, that concept of replication, one of the nice things that we were able to do is because we work with a lot of different clients using these same types of fundamental job fit assessments, is we can see that screening out those that score poorly on the assessment versus those that score strongly, you can consistently see this impact of the assessment on job turnover, or time and time again we'll see that people that score low on the assessments tend to turn over more quickly than those that score high. So there's a performance issue as well as a how long am I going to stick around in the job issue that we're able to replicate over time.
So what are the key takeaways when you're trying to look at turnover? Well, you need to focus on areas of interest and then break it down to understandable bite-sized chunks. So if you look across the analysis we looked at today, you see it occurring at different stages within the employee life cycle. The first example looked at the vulnerability within that first 30 and 60-day ranges. In the second example, we were able to see how the suite of assessments and how it can look at different stages within that employee life cycle. In both cases, there was that problem of early turnover, and the assessment was able to help diminish turnover in certain populations. So after we look at turnover, what other things can data analytics really help with? Well, it can look at performance and analyze performance to identify better performing employees. You gain some insight by looking at different performance metrics. You can see, is tenure having an impact on the people's performance? What level of performance do you see most people at? Where are the rock stars and what are driving those employees? And then, is everybody around the same range? Is there a consistent performance metric that's out there? And you're able to optimize hiring assessments based around these key metrics. All right, so we have this great retail client that we wanted to dive into, and what's interesting here is we were able to capture data at the individual employee level, and so we were able to see that our non-recommended employees were earning or were selling products at about $160 each, whereas our recommended and strongly recommended had a 10% increase on that amount. So if you were to take only our recommended and strongly recommended employees and look at the number of hours they work over the course of the year, just if you reduced those 34 bad hires, you could gain over $700,000 in additional revenue just from that lost earnings at your store.
And from a client relationship standpoint, these are some of the best case studies to work on. So these were cases of people who were chosen to be hired for the role in spite of their assessment results, and then you track their performance over time, and you see that even though they took a chance on this person that they thought they had a relationship with, or they thought they had some good experience in the role, they scored poorly on the assessment, and we wound up being able to go back to the client and confirm that. And there was something about that person's innate personality, their lack of fit with the role, that really prevented them from being successful in the role. And so this is kind of the best case use of analytics to drive hiring decisions. Oftentimes we'll roll out with a strategy where they allow some of those not recommends, and pretty quickly they'll go back to the field and say, you know what, we tried that, it's not working. From this point forward, we're changing our hiring decision. Only look at the recommends and the strongly recommends, because we have the evidence to support using that hiring decision. It's clearly not working. Those people are costing us money, every one of those not recommends that we hire, rather than replacing them or hiring someone else that scores higher on the assessment instead. Something else that's an important point here is from that level of analysis issue, the data that we were looking at were sales per hour. And I think it's really critically important to boil the data down to that individually controllable level. So in this case, each one of these people may work different numbers of hours per week. But if you can look at it on an hour-by-hour basis, that's the great equator. That's the level of analysis where you can really see those individual differences come out. A lot of times the first round of data we'll get from clients will just say what their average monthly sales were. And if we don't account for how much they actually worked, or sometimes if we don't account for the amount of store volume, some people may work in a store that does 2 or 3 times the volume of some others. And if you don't control for some of those basic things, then that's really going to skew your analysis. You can wind up making decisions that are essentially based off of error. So it sounds straightforward, but we always call that out. It's important to think about what can the individual really control and how do you boil it down to an apples-to-apples comparison as much as possible when you do these types of analytics.
That's a great point there, Keith. Continuing on this whole vein here, we are looking at the restaurant industry and able to see a longitudinal improvements on server earnings. So this is where we took servers and then looked at their hourly or their tabletop rate, like what was the average per person sell for each server. And those scoring highest on the assessment had the largest per hour earning difference, and it was essentially $1.18 in 2015, and then over the course of 2 years it bumped up to $2.63 in 2017.
And again, that level of analysis issue came in here, where if we weren't teasing out that year-by-year analysis, you'd start to muddle the effect that we're seeing there. So you can see there that we've kind of plotted across that chart the difference in sales from 2015 versus the difference in the average sales for 2017. There's a pretty significant jump up for 2017 sales, so it's important to split out the years and to take into account the year that person was performing in addition to looking at the differences to really call out the true nature of that difference in performance results.
All right, so what are the key takeaways here from looking at performance as your scope of analysis? You need to consider the specific impact that your analysis can have, and then it's always great to benchmark against other experiences. So if we go back and look at the 2015 to 2017, those past experiences to see how large of a difference that really is. In our performance analysis, we're able to look at the differences in performance between those that were recommended and those that were not recommended or told to avoid. The first example, we were able to see how it affected sales at the hourly level, as well as in the second example, we looked at how the assessment results related to sales at the transaction level, and then we're able to extrapolate that to thousands of dollars of savings for each of the company. And then, so this is one of the more recent product suites added to OutMatch, and it allows for reference checking to be a part of the process. So a company that we had took over 6,000 applicants, and then each of them were required to give 3 recommendations or references to be completed. So that's over 17,000 references that needed to be completed, and that equated to hiring roughly 3,000 individual hires. So if you just go through and do the whole math workout on this, that it takes an average reference check about 3 days to occur.
With their old process.
With the old process.
They were doing the kind of manual form of reference checking with recruiters calling people up and collecting that information over the phone. It was a huge time suck that was taking place with those recruiters. It was taking a huge amount of human resource just to get through those reference checks.
So by using this new automated procedure, they ended up saving over 4,000 hours of recruiter time, which ended up saving the company close to $100,000 alone just by using this assessment. A neat additional feature to that tool is that it asks everybody that's giving a reference, hey, would you be interested in applying for a job at this company as well? And by using that feature, this company added an additional 1,700 additional candidates to their pool of candidates, which would save additional advertising costs that the company did not have to go and advertise because they got all these additional applicants. And then by using the references, they were able to remove 660 bad hires from the process. They got poor performance reviews or poor references from all of these, and which ended up saving over $2 million in total.
So this was kind of the holy grail of analytics. We were able to bring in these three different sources of information. There's one that was kind of the current time savings from an HR standpoint. There was improving the number of candidates and reducing advertising costs related to that, as well as a screening component by screening out those candidates that were not likely to be successful in the job, who got a poor reference recommendation when we asked those questions. You kind of were able to aggregate these in the form of the common bottom line metric, which is dollars saved. And you can total those up and say, by implementing this one tool, it had an impact on dollars saved in three different ways. And that's kind of a nice way to think about the creative ways to use analytics to aggregate information and say, not only is this saving us money in place A, but also in place B and C, and you can aggregate all of that and look at the total ROI of an assessment solution or any kind of a tool that you implement from in the human capital management environment.
It's something we talked about earlier, is that you need to identify the problem, but this company didn't even know they had a problem, that they were spending so much extra time talking to all of these references, and so they were actually pleased to see this type of added benefit from using this type of product.
Absolutely.
So what kind of takeaways do you have here? Well, you need to turn your recommendations, turn your insight and your analytics into dollars. In this case, we simply adding a step into this whole process into a variety of change. It did change several different aspects of the hiring process. There was time saved through the automated reference checking. It added candidates to the pool of qualified candidates, and it was ensuring quality candidates were most likely to succeed in the job. Although each of these was interesting by itself, cumulatively it had such a great impact on this one client. So what are some of the key takeaways from today's webinar? Well, the things that we need to look at were effective analysis is kind of the key result here. We need to focus on areas of interest. You need to identify the problem, and then once you identify that problem, you can break it down to understanding the broader trends.
And I don't think that can be overstated. In any type of analytics that we undertake, it's always our approach to start with training wheels, find some simple basic level of analysis that we can start out at, and then get more sophisticated over time. As you learn a little bit more about the problem and you can start to code the data in ways where you can tease out other factors that will influence it, then you can get more sophisticated. But a lot of times it's just a matter of getting started. If you can start by looking at some, just a couple of simple variables and then add to that over time, you're better off than getting overly complex from the start where you never even get out of the gates.
That's so true. And then consider the specific impact that your analysis will have. You're not going to say, oh, I'm going to change the world with this analysis, but if you're able to say, I can reduce so much turnover in my company, even 5%, that can have a very impactful statement for your company. Benchmark against past experience is oh so important. If you knew how you were last year, all you need to do is make incremental changes to get where you want to go. So you need to measure how you were then and measure where you are now. And that's the easiest rule that you can follow in analytics. And then, of course, something that we love to do, it's always fancy and the marketing department loves it. You need to turn your recommendations, turn your analytics into dollars. So that's the dollar bill rules the world. So you need to be able to turn whatever analysis you get into some actionable result and to be able to show true value with that.
Well, a lot of times that's the challenge people are faced with is how do I do more with the same budget? And if you start to think about it, yes, I might spend more on some tool that's going to help me with a human capital challenge that I have, but if I can quantify the results from that and demonstrate that ultimately I'm going to be saving money, then that makes it a little easier to make that decision. So just to summarize here at the end, and then we'll get to questions and answers, hopefully we've been able to show you some different ways that analysis can provide some insight from data. We talked about some of the fundamental issues around data collection, around data quality that you need to pay attention to. It's important that you act on that data for it to be useful, so you can do all the analysis in the world, and if you don't ever make any recommendations or don't ever make a decision to do something about it, then it's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to have a change or a result for you. We do see value in leveraging experts to validate those data conclusions. So if you have questions, I'm seeing this impact, but I'm not sure if it's real. Sometimes consulting with an expert around statistical analysis or just somebody who knows the business very well. So one of the fundamental things we do in any one of our research studies is we want to talk to, if we're looking at assessment results versus sales performance, we always make it a point to talk to the sales experts. We want to talk to the person that knows that role better than anyone and knows all the different factors that can impact sales performance so that we can control for the things that we need to and get that insight and expertise from them. So whether they're an internal consultant or an external consultant, it's important to think about how can I get educated, how can I learn all of the different things possible about the data that I'm working with. And then if you do those things, then the data that you can gather can really be used to answer a lot of different questions relevant to the hiring process and all of those other follow-on aspects of human capital management that Casey touched on earlier, whether it's employee engagement or job turnover or succession planning and performance appraisal, any of those different aspects. There's data there. It's just a matter of thinking about how to get access to it, how to merge it together and turn it into useful analytics that you can translate into dollar impact.
That's great, Keith.
So at this point, we'll check in with Holly and see if we have any questions that have rolled in.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for being with us and sharing some awesome knowledge with us. We have had some good lineup of questions come in. And guys, keep them coming. If you haven't yet submitted questions for our presenters, please go ahead and submit those to that question and answer box just underneath the webcast player. And so we'll get to our first of several questions. First one up comes from Mike. He says, how are you getting review/performance info when companies are not allowed to disclose that only date of employment, etc.?
So a lot of times we're doing that within the context of a relationship we have with the employer. So if we're doing a research study, we might use some kind of neutral identifier. So you can use a unique combination of the first couple of letters of somebody's name plus their date of birth or something that's not absolutely identifiable. We can use that as kind of an interim point to match the data from our assessment system and their performance system so that we're taking names and unique identifiers out of the equation, but we're still able to merge the two data sources together. Other times we've passed the information, so we'll send over a key to them with names and a unique identifier and have them do the matching internally, and then they can share back with us, just the unique identifier, and we can match up the data that way. So there's different kind of handshakes and approaches that you can do with it. And also more and more, we're being asked to integrate our solutions into company HRM applications. So if they have a PeopleSoft or any of those types of tools, sometimes there's a unique key that's already connected across there, and that makes the data merges a little easier.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, guys. And we'll move to the next question that comes in from Vanessa. And we'll reflect on that retail talk a little bit. So she says, with your retail example, did you control or check for what day of the week people were selling?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's one that it's a little harder to tease out. And I would say in most of the studies that we've done, that level of analysis is not captured within their data sets. We do know that, especially at a seasonality level, we tend to look for it month to month. So in retail, they talk a lot about the golden quarter, where sales, and if you're looking at sales for October, November, and December versus the rest of the year, all bets are off. You have to kind of isolate those sales and look at those differently. But days of the week, I haven't been involved in an analysis where the salespeople, the sales experts we talked about that being a huge differentiator. Yeah. But it's a good topic to think about.
Yeah, we usually look at either month totals or week totals, but I haven't got down to the day level, but that would be really interesting to look at.
Yeah. One thing that we'll do a lot of times is we'll make sure that we're only including people that worked more than kind of a minimum hour. So we include people that worked at least 20 hours per week, so that increases the odds that they're at least working over a few random days in the week and aren't likely to be kind of the weekend warrior that has superstar sales just because they worked every Saturday and Sunday.
Yeah.
And thanks, guys. Our next question comes from Logan. So how do you mitigate the subjectivity of performance reviews when making predictions on future performance?
That's a really good question there.
Yeah. That's one of the most critical issues we face is what is the definition of good performance? If you look at supervisor ratings versus if you look at objective data in the system, I'll tell you from personal experience, there are times where we do research studies and we collect both of those metrics, and there's a really strong relationship between how the supervisors rated people and what their actual sales per hour or other types of objective metrics are. There are other times where we collect that data and there's almost no correlation. And essentially that becomes a stop and talk moment with the client where we say, you know, you're asking us to develop this model of what good looks like for your selection purposes going forward, and we've got to hash out that through conversation, through further research, by going back and collecting more data. But that's a real world challenge that we face. And our preference is to go with objective data as much as possible. But having said that, you have to have the right objective data. Sometimes that data is messy or is not controlled for in the ways that it needs to be controlled for, so it's a challenge.
Yeah. And then we also, whenever we start a brand new study, we usually send out our own survey to managers and say, we rate your employees, and they'll always come back and say, oh, we had our yearly performance review last week. What can't we just send you that data? And every time we've gotten a performance review from managers, everybody has the mean score, and no one's a terrific employee and no one's an awful employee. Yeah. And we come back to them and say, there's no variability in your data here. There's almost no analysis that can be done.
So for those subjective ratings that we do as part of our research study, we'll send out a special questionnaire and say, this is for research purposes only. Only the people within our external consulting firm are going to see the results, the individual scores on the ratings that you give. It won't impact pay. It won't impact performance decisions. This is our secret. Basically just for this research project, you're telling us who the superstars are and who the really poor performers are. And when you set it up in that context, and they know that it really is a safe environment to disclose who the top performers are and not, then you tend to get a lot more variability in the performance ratings and a better quality response that way. So that's a good point, Casey.
All right, thanks, guys. We have a question coming in from Steve. He says, have you used employee referral data to make decisions about where you are going to direct funds from your advertising budget?
We haven't before, but we've had this talk with several of our clients as we've kind of instituted this, and they've seen that certain quality candidates come from LinkedIn and certain job fairs, and maybe certain clients don't come, or candidates come well from Craigslist, or maybe a certain university job fairs, they get A-plus candidates all the time, and then the certain job fairs they don't. And so we've seen clients that have either stopped participating in certain job fairs just because if you track that information, you can identify where quality candidates are coming from and save money there.
Yeah, and I think you put employee referrals as one of those sources, right? It could be from a job fair, it could be from an online job board, or it could be an employee referral. I don't know that I've heard a consistent theme of them saying that over and over again employee referrals are the highest quality. It may be that that's the case, but I haven't heard that.
Yeah, it's usually bad referral is something to take into account, and then the okay ones you tend to kind of brush off at some point.
All right, thanks so much, guys. Our next question comes in from Anthony. He wants to know, what are the most common data challenges that you face when trying to find insights for a client?
I would say, from my standpoint, one of the most fundamental challenges is just getting it in the right format. As simple as that sounds, kind of extracting the sales data out of the system where it's aggregated at an appropriate level so that we can analyze it without reinventing the wheel on our side. So a lot of the instances of data that we get would either be so specific where it's week by week by week by week, and we wind up with a data file that's 500 rows wide, and we have to then kind of write all the coding to aggregate that data into a higher level that we can analyze. That's the one extreme where it just becomes so time intensive to spend time getting it into a format we can do something with, or getting data that's too general, where it's just average sales for last year without controlling for any of those other variables that we talked about on the call. And then there's a whole host of other issues on how do you merge the data, keeping it anonymous, protecting the candidate's confidentiality, and still do it in a way where you have a level of confidence that you've got the right cases merged up. Those are all significant challenges that wind up taking a lot of time.
Yeah, and that's quite true. We've had a couple of clients that their employees are very transient, and so they may start at one location and then another location has people out sick or maternity leave or something, and then so they'll have to move from one location to another. And then you start trying to get performance measures, and they're like, oh, well, they were only here for 3 weeks, and then they were over here for 6 weeks, and then here for 4 months. And so we, on our general scope, we have to end up removing them just because how do you standardize across 7 different locations, which some of them are high-volume locations and others are low-volume locations.
Store managers are a tricky lot because you're trying to track the true effect of their performance. And if they worked in 3 different locations last year and 2 different ones the year before that, if they're moving around a lot, then how do you catch their performance in the right place at the right time? That becomes a pretty exhaustive exercise to control for all of those things. To Casey's point, it's easier if you know that person was in the store for the entire year, then you have that higher level of confidence that they were really impacting the store's performance. But those can get tricky.
Yeah, and I mean having HRIS systems in place help that quite a bit, but it's still not the silver bullet.
I get the most excited when I hear that we're doing studies for a 100% commission job, because if the candidates are getting, or if the employees are getting paid purely based on their performance, then they typically have really good metrics in place because they have to.
They have to.
And those are tend to be more straightforward assessments or
studies,
analysis of relationships where we can really see the impact of assessments on job performance.
All right, thank you. We have a question coming in from Mike. He says, when looking at candidates, how many years of review are you looking at, and how do you take into account those shifting careers and industries?
I would say for the bulk of the work that we do, if we're developing automated assessments, a lot of it is for high-volume positions, where realistically we're looking at their first year to 18 months, maybe a couple of years in role, and that tends to be the typical length of tenure for a lot of these roles. So you don't have to worry so much about performance in years 2, 3, 4, and 5, and how tenure in the job is really going to dramatically impact performance. That does come into play sometimes, but for a lot of these, we're looking at a pretty finite period of time where everybody has kind of the same amount of experience, and so that makes it pretty straightforward. Casey, I don't know if you have.
Yeah, I mean, that tends to be the case that if you're looking at professional level, we might go out 5 years or so, maybe to the 10-year mark. But for most of our analysis where we're doing the high volumes, burger flippers, tire changers, the lifespan of those roles just tends to be a few years. And so looking at any performance metrics beyond that are generally moot.
And we do some basic things. So we'll look at the relationship between tenure and job performance. And if you see a big spike, so people that are in the job 3 to 6 months tend to perform at X level, and then 6 to 12 months they escalate and they tend to perform quite a bit better. Then one of the forms of analysis we'll do is we'll say, if we control for tenure, do we get a clearer signal of the relationship between whatever personal variables we're gathering in job performance? So if we kind of say, compared to other people that were in the job the same amount of time that they were, what was their performance like? Then that's one form of looking at the relationships that we'll do, and that can help.
All right, sounds good. We'll take a question from Daryl. He says, so how do we get started? If everything we do is in Excel, one by one, how do we move past that?
That's a good question. I would say a little bit of computer expertise can go a long way. So if you bring in somebody who's increasingly there's more and more people that are coming out of graduate schools or even undergraduate programs with degrees in data analysis or data visualization. So I think that's become a pretty hot major, and I think that would be money well spent to go find a green
Even an intern.
Or an intern, somebody that's really comfortable working with those types of files, and they could help you to really take a giant step forward by either using Excel and some of the functionality that's there around pivot tables or merging different data sources together. And you can do quite a bit of analytics within Excel by itself. But then if you get a basic server up and running where you're able to merge two different data sources together, there's some great tools out there like Sisense or Domo that can allow you to do kind of point-and-click real-world data analysis and visualization, and I think those can have a huge impact on your ability to do analysis as well.
Yeah, the first step really is collecting good quality data and you feeling confident in what you're collecting. We've had clients within the last year or two that say that they still get faxed copies from some of their locations, and then they hire an intern to manually type in the results from that faxed in copy.
Right.
And we're asking them, how confident are you that that's going to be true quality data? And they said that it's about 50-50 shot whether that's going to be true and legitimate numbers.
That's a good point.
So you really need to be confident in, and if you're working in Excel, there's so many tools and add-ons that you can do within Excel to get at some of these results. But first step, you have to have the data and be confident within it.
All right, thank you guys. We'll take one more question, and this one comes from Daniel. And he says, what are some of the most common requests that you hear from clients, and what do people typically want to know?
I would say one of the most common requests we get is just wanting to understand their data, and a lot of times just wanting to have insight into how candidates are performing really early in the job. And I think that's one of the challenges. Back to that data quality issue is if I've hired 10 people with the assessment, can I look and see how the assessment is working? Can I look for differences? A lot of the requests that we would get are right out of the gates, just having that need for information and wanting to track things over time, and that's a real challenge until you get to significant numbers. We try to avoid drawing any conclusions until we can gather a reasonable amount of data, until we get 100 candidates or a couple hundred candidates that are through the door, where we can really start to aggregate some information and not report something back that's not going to hold up 6 months later, or it's going to be impacted by error or bias in the data collection. So yeah, that's a challenge that I see.
And we see quite a bit of people come and say, the first question, we want to hire good quality candidates, and two, we want to reduce our turnover and we want to make everybody stay. And sometimes those two things are at odds. If you're hiring rock star people that are great candidates, but then you're paying them $7 an hour, they're not going to stay with you forever because somebody's going to offer them $10 an hour to do it somewhere else. So you have to identify really what you want, and then sometimes it's kind of reconciling, I want good candidates, but I want them to stay, so there's other things you need to change in your process and figure out why those people are leaving. If they're leaving because they're good candidates and get paid more elsewhere, maybe you need to either lower your threshold for what you think is a good candidate or pay your employees more. Yeah. It's kind of a two-edged sword there.
Yeah, I'd say most of the questions that we get are really just around the fundamentals. How do we hire better people? How do we know whether we're hiring better people? And how do we gather data in a systematic way so that we can have a good sense of that and track it over time?
All right, thanks so much, guys. And we have arrived to the end of our material for today. So we'll close with one more thank you to Keith and Casey and to everyone at OutMatch for helping to make today's webcast happen. As always, we do appreciate our listeners who took time out of their days to spend with us. From all of us here at HCI, thank you for joining us and have a great day.